Hello and welcome everyone to today's episode. Today we are going to be covering the following topics. All the timestamps are in the description below. And I hope you enjoy today's episode. So let's get started on these topics. So we already have a student class, and this student class is mapped to the students table here within the school database. So you can see we've got the following students, and this is the SQL to get the result over here. So now we want to add another table for teachers, but all we want to do is currently the students table here is named same as the class. So if I go over to the Visual Studio Code window over here, and you can see we have student over here. But what if we wanted another table called staff in the backend, but within the Visual Studio Code, we wanted to call it teacher rather than staff. So in the backend database, this would be staff, and in the Visual Studio Code, it would be teacher. What you can use is you can use a table annotation here and provide a table name. So this will link in with a table name called staff in the backend. In order to use the annotation, you need to include this over here. So what this will allow you to do is use the schema annotation, which is where the table annotation comes from. So if you were to remove this line over here, then VS Code will complain to say this namespace table attribute could not be found. You're missing namespace. So that's why at the beginning here, so you can see data annotation, but you need to add in data annotation dot schema, and this is where the table annotation lives. So this is going to have the same columns as the student table. So we will just leave them in this example as they are. So next we need to add in within the DB context, the teacher class over here as a table. So we will copy this and simply change this to teacher. So then we're going to save this, and then we're going to create a migration. So here we're going to run this migration to add teacher staff table, and you can see the build started and build succeeded. So now if we have a look at our migrations over here, in the migration folder, we should see teacher staff table. So what you can see here is create table, and notice the table name is called staff. Now this is important because we've called it that, although in C# we called a teacher as the class name, but in behind the scenes in the database, we want this table to be called staff. So that's what it will add. So at the minute, the change hasn't been applied to the database. We need to run one more command to apply the change to the database to get the new table. So we're going to run this command to simply update the database. So it's .NET EF database update, and the command is running, and that's succeeded. So now if we have a look at our database, so I'm going to refresh the tables over here. So come over to tables, and then I'm going to click this refresh button. And you can see there's now a table called staff. And if I do a top 1000 rows, you can see it's empty at the minute, no records. So you can see the table has been named staff over here, while in the code, we've called a teacher just by using the data annotation table, which you need also to reference from this using statement. So this comes from data annotation dot schema. So that's important to understand. It's within this namespace, and that basically allows you to have a different table name in the backend database versus what you have in your C# code for the class name. So teacher and then staff. This is how you map if you have different names. And you can do the same thing with columns by just changing the annotation here to column and then putting it on top of a column such as here, such as name. Then you can change the field name it maps to behind the scene in the database. So in this instance, we'll just change it back to the table. So this teacher class maps to the staff database table. So you can have different names in the backend versus what you have in the front end. So we have this entity framework class over here, and currently this table maps to the staff table. So if we have a look at our database, you can see I've got the staff table here. But let's say a database administrator renamed your table. How would you then map against the new table using entity framework? That's quite simple with data annotations. So let's say I am the admin and I rename this table to staff 2 over here. And now if I go back here and try and run my code where I am trying to add some records here to the teachers and the teachers class over here, it will actually map to the staff table. So it's going to look for the staff table that doesn't really exist in the database because the database administrator has renamed that to staff 2. If I run this code here, we should get an error. There you go. We have an error here. It's a long method, but right at the beginning, it will say invalid object name staff. So we have this here is looking for staff and it can't find it because in the database, it's been renamed to staff 2. So the easiest fix you can do is basically just change here the table that it points to staff 2, and you don't have to modify any of your classes. So this is one of the advantages with this table annotation over here, which comes from this schema name over here, which is same as the data annotations here, but this is referring to the schema in particular. So what you can do is we now called it staff2 rather than staff. So if we run this now, we should find that our code works as expected. And there you go. Our code has worked. There are no errors over here. So now let's go over to the database and see if any records have been added. So we are now in the database, and if I do a select on this, you can see records have been added, and we do get the names over here, and these are from staff2 table. So that's one of the big advantages of using annotations like this, which is you can change the table name very quickly without having to change any of your class or any code which refers to the class. Basically, that's the static. Even like adding records over here, you don't have to change that. The underlying table is simply changed by using the annotation over here. So just make sure that you're using the following namespace at the top as well. Otherwise, if I comment this out, you will get an error over here to say the namespace didn't exist. Make sure to add this in at the top for your code to work. Previously, you saw how we renamed a table using entity framework. So basically, in C# we have a table called teacher, and in the backend we have the table called staff2. Now let's say actually that we want to do the name column. So the name column over here, we're just going to leave it as it is. So in the backend database, so here we've got the staff2 table, and if we expand the columns over here, so you can see the column name here is the one we want to change. So let's say the DBA changes the name of this column. If we have a look at the data inside it, so it appears it's just the first name of your staff members. So now what we want to do is we want to change the name column to first name. So if we go in here and rename and change that to first name. So now the database administrator has changed the name to first name rather than just name. So if you were to try and run your program over here, so here the program is trying to run, and you will get an error message over here. So here, as you can see, we've got the error message to say invalid column name over here. So the column is called name, and that column doesn't exist in our database because it's been changed to first name. So what we can do is, so this is the same concept. We use this syntax here and this data annotation. So we use this data annotation to change the table name, and it's the same data annotation we can use to change the column name. Instead of table, we're going to call it column. So we will just simply copy this over here, and we will come over here next to the name column, and just above it, we are going to add in column, and we are going to change this to first name. Now, in order for this annotation to work, you need to make sure you are using the correct namespace at the top. So this namespace, you can see it's slightly different. So this one, the first one, and the data annotation, for anything to do with the schema of the database, you need to make sure you include this sub namespace, which is schema. So this is separate to the one over here. Although it comes under the same hierarchy, you still have to declare it separately. If you don't declare it, so if I were to comment this out, so this has been commented out, and now if I scroll down, you can see we get error here, and we get error for the table annotation because it's saying that the namespace doesn't actually contain the table attribute, and same here, it doesn't contain the column attribute. So what we need to do is we need to use this namespace. So we'll comment this out, and now you can see the error has gone away over here and over here. So now that this line has been added, everything should map across correctly. So if I run this program now, we should find that there are no errors occurring, and you can see our program has successfully run, and you can see that the first name column is there, and this maps correctly now to the backend database. So you can see the advantage of using the data annotation over here is your column could be called anything within your code, but within the backend it can have a different name. So that provides you with some flexibility if you have teams that are split across database administrators and front-end application developers. Let's explore tracking versus no tracking in entity framework. So here you can see we are using the students table over here. So this is the data model that exists within entity framework that links in with the backend table called students. And what we're doing is we're just going to get the first value or the default value if the value is not found. So here, what we're basically doing is for the student ID, we're going to look for if it's equal to 1, return that student. We know that a student with ID number 1, but it should return 1 student. And then we're going to update its name. Then we'll execute using the database context, the save changes. So essentially, we've got a connection here and we want to save changes. And this will update the database. So here is, if you look at this one, we are basically doing the same thing as above. So you can see this and this matches over here, but you will see that there's an extra method being executed here, which is as NoTracking. And then we are using the first or the default method and doing the same thing looking for student one. And we are going to change the student name to new name, and then we are going to do save changes. So at this point, what we should find is the new name over here should not get saved back to the database. So let's have a look at our database first. So you can see our database is here, and we've got the following students. So you can see the first student, Ali, over here. We want to change his name. In the code, when we run this should change to updated name. But this bit over here, when it executes, it shouldn't change the name to new name. So if we were to run this over here, so as you can see, our application has finished executing. So now if we go over to the database and if we just execute this query again and click on execute, we should find that it has updated name and it changed the name from Ali to updated name over here. So if we have a look at this, it didn't change it to new name because we used the NoTracking method here, even though we executed save changes. Because it was NoTracking, it never actually made the relevant change. It only made the change in the local dataset, but not in the original database. So why would you use as NoTracking? So if we have a look at NoTracking versus tracking. So with tracking, what you can do is you can read data and update it. So yeah, that's fine, but you cannot use it for read-only queries, large data reads and disconnected scenarios, and caching or storing data locally. So ideally shouldn't be used for these purposes, although you can if you wanted to. So with NoTracking, basically your queries run faster. You can do large data reads. You can use it for disconnected scenarios like web APIs, and we'll do that at some point in the future. And you can see that you can also use it for caching data locally. So yeah, just remember that you can just use as NoTracking, and that means that your save changes won't reflect any changes that you make over here. While if you don't use NoTracking over here versus over here, then you'll get the desired output that you want. So we were discussing tracking and NoTracking and how by default Entity Framework uses tracking. So i.e. if you grab some data using a query and store it in a variable. So here we are just getting a student ID of 1. First or default basically means if there is a student found, then return that student, otherwise use the default value. So here, what we are going to do is we're going to update the student name, and we're going to take save changes over here. So by using this save changes method over here, what this will do is update the database. You also have the NoTracking option. So as you can see, the difference between this is the same, and the only difference is that this method have been added on before we execute the first or default query. And here we're just looking at the same student one. So what will happen is with this query, it will load the student, store it in the same variable, just as it would do over here. So it's just getting the student, and now at this point we're updating the student variable here, student 2, to new name. But because we use NoTracking, what will happen is when you do save changes here versus save changes here, the method over here, this one will not save changes back to the database. So what you can do instead is, let's say you made loads of changes, some logic and so on, and at the end you want to update the database. So what you can do is you can just pass that variable, which is the student2 variable, into context students update method over here, and this will take the student and then do the necessary changes that have happened and then save the changes. So let's try this. Let's do it without using this method. So what we should find is it will change this student name to updated name for student 1, but it won't change it to new name. So if I were to run this program, before we run the program, let's have a look at our data. So student 1, ID 1, we've got Ali here, and we want to change his name. So it should only change the student and not Sarah or John. So let's run our application over here, and you can see our application is running and it has finished executing. So if we go over to our database over here, and I'm just going to run this query again by clicking on this execute button, and you can see the student name has changed to updated name, but it has not changed to new name. So you can see over here that we went with new name here, and that's not reflected in the database. So what we can do is we can enable these lines over here. So even though we are not using tracking here, but let's now assume that we changed our mind and we do want to update, then what we can do is we can run this update method, pass it to the student number 2, which is the one that will have this new name, and then we're going to give save changes. So if I run this over here now, and you can see our code has finished executing. So if we go to the database, you can see previously with updated name. So if we now execute this, and you can see it has changed to new name here, which is what we wanted to do. So just remember, NoTracking basically doesn't allow updating the data, but it does allow read-only large data reads, disconnected scenarios such as web APIs and caching of the data locally, while tracking basically allows you to update it. But even if you use NoTracking, then you can still use the update method here against your DB set, which is basically a table. So against the context of your database connection, using the student's model, you can actually pass it back a student that you found here, even though NoTracking was used, and still save changes to the database. Sometimes in SQL Server Management Studio, you get these errors, and these errors are squiggly lines to say, for example, invalid object. So here, for example, it's saying it's unable to find this table over here, subjects, but if we have a look at our Object Explorer, you can see that table exists and all the columns do exist. So why is it then this is complaining of an error? This happens when you create a new object in Management Studio, either by using SQL or by using the designer. This Management Studio won't pick up your new table name. So what you need to do is you need to refresh the local cache, and you can do this by going to Edit and then going down to Intellisense, and then there's an option called Refresh Local Cache. You can also use the key Control-Shift-R, and this shortcut will refresh the local cache. So you can see at the minute over here, I'm getting the underlined errors, but as soon as I go to Edit, Intellisense, and then I click on to refresh local cache, you will see the errors will disappear. So I've clicked on that, and after a short delay, you can see the underlined errors have disappeared. So this is one of the things I found with Management Studio you have to do, and you might get confused as to why it's saying invalid objects when actually the objects do exist within your Object Explorer and on your database. What you need to do is remember, so you need to be in this window and then click on to Edit and then click on to Intellisense and refresh. This won't work. So if you go another window highlighted like this and then you go to the Edit menu, you'll find there's no options. So the options that appear when you're on this window are different versus when you are on this window and then the Intellisense option appears. So it only appears when you highlight this window. So I hope you found this tip useful. So did you know that in Entity Framework, you can use the FromSql Raw method here to run custom SQL query? So here you can see we are just getting any students who are over the age of 20. Now you could have done this using link. So you can see here, this is the link method of doing it. So this is using the where method here, and then you can use the order by and then to list. But you can use the FromSql Raw and you're executing it against the context here and students. So it's important that this bit is referring to the students class or their DB set, and you're accessing the context. And you can see here, even with the link, you're accessing context and you're accessing students, but then you're applying your link methods over here, whereas here we are just applying over from SQL Raw and we're just applying a raw SQL statement over here and pretty much doing very similar to what this statement is doing. The other thing you can do, even with the result from SQL Raw, is you can then loop through the order students too, which is this raw SQL method, and you can still, for example, update the name of the student and save the changes back to the database. Because although this seems like a raw SQL query, but Entity Framework is able to match it against the student class. The reason it's able to match against the student class or the DB set is if you look at your program structure, this is what a student looks like. And what we are doing is when we declare a DB set, we are saying it's of type student. And that's where the students table exists in the backend. Have a look at our backend database. So you can see we have the following student: John, Sarah, Ali. And you can see the structure of this. This has an ID column, a name column, age, city, and is active. And you can see here we've got the same structure here. We've got the ID, the name, age, city, and is active. So although you can see that it appears as the raw query, but Entity Framework is clever enough because you're using the context and student is able to map this back to the database. So if you make any changes, then this code will still work when you do save changes. Remember, the query that's returned here and the object that it returns are trackable for changes. So let's test this out where we are updating anyone that is over the age of 20. So this means that over the age of 20, so that will be Sarah and John, their names should get updated. So if I run this over here, And you can see this is finished. So if we go over here and refresh our database, now that our code has finished running, and you can see the name has been updated over here. So by just using FromSql Bro, we are not losing much of Entity Framework's capabilities. If you have a situation where you need to use Raw SQL versus using the link methods over here. So previously we have used FromSql Raw method here in Entity Framework to execute a Raw SQL statement over here. Now, previously what we did was we updated using the Raw SQL statement here. We got the results over here, and then we basically went through and made changes to each of the students' name that is over the age of 20 over here. But what if we wanted our query to be read-only? So by simply adding in this method over here as NoTracking, which is built into Entity Framework, we have made this read-only. So what will happen is, even if you try and update something here, this update that happens is only done locally within this variable here, which holds the list of students, and it won't actually get applied to the database because we have turned off tracking. So simply by enabling or disabling this method over here, you can make your queries read-only. So here, this is to prove that our query is read-only. We are going to leave it on here, and we are going to run our code. So if we have a look at, before we run the code, we can have a look at our database. So you can see here we have the following students, and over the age of 20 are these two students. So their name should get updated. But if we run the code, what we should find is it has no effect on the database because of this method over here, which disables tracking. So if we run this over here, so you can see the code has finished running. And if we go over to the database, and now in the database, if I refresh this, you can see that our student names remain the same. But if we now disable this method here and the rest of the code remains the same, this has now become a read and write dataset. So we are able to save changes back to the database by issuing this command over here. And if I run this again, and what you find is it had finished running. And if we go over to our database, and here in the database, if I click the refresh button, and you can see the student names have been updated. So by simply using as tracking, you can make something read only. So simply by using NoTracking here, you can make something read-only, and you can turn it off or remove this method over here, and then that becomes read and write query. So this is from SQL Raw, how you can make your dataset read or write or read-only. And remember the context here, that's just your connection to the database that we set up as part of Entity Framework. So you can see this is the DB context, and if we go up here, that's where I have declared context variable, which is basically new school context. And new school context just comes from over here. This is a class that inherits from DB context. If you want to know more about this, then check out my other explanations on DB context and how this works in the background with Entity Framework. So we looked at the FromSql Raw method over here, but there's an issue with this method, which is you could end up coding it like this, where you are expecting a parameter to be passed in by the user, for example, or from another place in your code. For example, we have the following, which is bad age, and you can see what's happening here is this is being terminated with a semicolon, and then a drop statement is being issued to drop the student's table. So this is a bad actor could drop your table because in SQL the semicolon marks the end of a statement. So what it is there is another method available, which is FromSqlInterpolated. And what this does is, although it looks very similar to the above method, but by using this method you get different output. So there are two ways SQL Server executes statements, and this was done to prevent attacks like this, which is somebody passing in a drop statement by the parameter. So behind the scenes, the difference between this method and this method is the interpolated method. It actually generates the code in this fashion. So this is the SQL code. So behind the scenes, Entity Framework uses ADO.NET, and it will issue your query in two parts. One, which is the query with the parameter where it should be, and then it passes the parameter separately. So it then will detect the parameter type, and whereas the statement, which is from Raw SQL, will actually generate something like this, which is it will issue the command, then it will have a semicolon, and then it will issue a drop statement. So the drop statement, although still goes through, but it has no effect because it's getting passed as a parameter. So that's an important distinction to be made, and I will explain this in more detail at some other point, but you need to understand that it is better to use the FromSqL interpolated method, plus you can use the string interpolation, which is the $sign here, and then you can just replace the age here while using this method over here from SQL Raw. Although it does allow string interpolation with the $sign, but it is unsafe because when it executes the SQL statement, it will basically append the bad age here with whatever is in this variable, which could be from the front-end user, where the user is able to type something such as, a value in a field. So I would always recommend that you use this method and do not use this method, as this one has lots of cybersecurity issues you should avoid. But you do need to be aware that both of these methods do exist, and as a developer, you should be making conscious effort to use this method over here rather than this one over here.